Welcome to Mini-In Service number 1 in our professional nurse competencies. This segment answers the question, what is nurse-to-nurse hostility?
Kathleen, today we're going to discuss nurse-to-nurse hostility. What exactly does this behavior look like?
Well, it's defined as a consistent pattern of behavior to control or diminish or devalue another person that creates a risk to harm or their own psychological or emotional safety. Basically, it's any behavior that makes you feel less than the competent, caring nurse or professional that you are. Some examples of it would be eye rolling, raised eyebrows, sighing, especially when you pick up the assignment sheet. It's like, walking away from somebody, ignoring, blaming, gossip, refusing to work with somebody, refusing to only work with certain people, sabotage, and I can give you an example of that. One nurse told me she worked on a med-surg unit, and when she didn't know how to do a procedure, she asked the charge nurse, and the charge nurse said, look it up in the procedure manual. She went to the procedure manual and it wasn't there, so she asked the other nurse, how to do it, and that nurse responded, what, have you been here almost a year now? Use your head, figure it out. The next day when she came into work, there was a note on her time card that said, see the manager before your shift, because those nurses had written her up for doing the procedure incorrectly. So all these behaviors are called horizontal hostility.
Okay. Why is it that we don't see this in a profession that's known to be so caring?
And it is. I mean, that's what first impressed me, is that I am so proud to be a member of a profession where I see nurses consistently deliver care, compassion to their patients, that I couldn't understand, why they didn't do it to each other. But I think the reason that we don't see it is because it doesn't match that image in our head of the caring nurse. It doesn't match the image that we have, and a herd mentality. We do what everybody else does. Another reason is, why am I going to notice something that I do myself? And we come into the culture, and through mimicry, we start matching the behaviors, the things that everybody else does. Another good reason is that we're focused on the workload. Lots of times we say things like, oh, she's in a bad mood. That's just the way he or she is, but she's a good nurse, or she's just having a bad day. And so we blow these things off as if they don't mean anything.
That's so interesting, because I think back over my career as a nurse, and I think to when I first started nursing school, my very first nursing class. And I had a professor who basically talked about weeding us out. And it just took me aback. I just couldn't understand. I thought this was about a profession of caring. And even when I think about it today, I have a visceral reaction to that. And at the time, I really questioned whether or not I could be a nurse.
I can understand that. When I collected stories, and I started by collecting randomly 30 stories from nurses, one of the common denominators is that everybody responded as if it had just happened yesterday, like they had PTSD, and it has a profound impact. I asked myself why. So my research is based on why would, in a caring profession, would nurses do things like this? And I think the first thing is that helped me is to understand it's part of our culture, and that we don't really see the culture that's around us. It's like a fish talking about water. It's the last thing we see, because it's just normal. We're normalized into a culture. So I take great comfort in the knowledge that I've never met a nurse who says to herself, I'm going to roll my eyes now, or I'm gonna walk away. These are not conscious behaviors. And Paulo Freire came out with a theory on oppression theory in the 1970s, which said that when one group, a dominant group, has more power than the other, the group that has all the power, they exert their power downward. But the oppressed group can't direct their power upward, so they unconsciously start attacking each other. And I think that's what it's about. It's about unconsciously. But what we have to do is call these behaviors out. One of my favorite sayings is that of a magician. His apprentice asked him, Master, how do we take the power away from something? And he responded, that's easy. You just call it by its name.
So one of the most important first steps is to recognize the behavior and name it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Instead of saying that's just the way he or she is, or so-and-so's having a bad day, that these are behaviors that undermine a culture of safety. They undermine trust. Their impact is profound, and they can't exist if our goal is to keep our patients safe. The other thing we have to realize, I think, is that some of them are more destructive than others. Dr. Cynthia Clark created a continuum of civility or incivility, where we start with the eye rolling and raised eyebrows, but that the intensity or the level of aggression increases. It goes to comments, sarcastic comments, bullying, racism, and then actually, could end in violence or tragedy, which has occurred. Nobody wants to be pushed away from the group, and we do what other people in a group do so that we can belong to the group. Unfortunately, this is something, that started many years ago.
And sometimes the behavior can be so subtle and that we don't really recognize it, and that's why we don't speak up, or we just, as I think you said earlier, well, that's just the way they are. So we kind of accept the behavior from some people. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. And we think it's us. For example, I was watching a bullying video on YouTube, and it's easy when somebody is physically intimidating somebody. You can say, wow, that's obviously wrong. But what if you suspect that the nurse, when you really needed help, was intentionally pretending she was busy? It's much more subtle, and it makes it harder to address. And what if you have a hunch? What if you have a feeling that when you walk into a room that all the conversation stopped, but you can't prove it? This is very damaging to our self-esteem. And the research shows that when we come into the nursing profession, our self-esteem is as high as any other profession. But when you come in and we let people get away with these behaviors, we don't call them out. We don't say, I noticed that you rolled your eyes. Did that mean you didn't want to work with me today? If we could point them out, that would be the very first step. So calling it what it is and pointing it out. And it doesn't have to be anything more than saying, I noticed. I noticed that you walked away, or I noticed that you sighed when you picked up the assignment sheet. Did you think that it wasn't fair today? And because we're not aware of our nonverbal behaviors, and they're very powerful.
So it's really important to, when you do that, it helps somebody understand how they may be coming across in that situation, and not intentionally doing it, or intentionally could be as well.
I can't tell you how many times I've spoken, and people will come up to me afterwards and say, I'm the bully you talked about. So there's a bully, the person who is doing that behavior, and lots of times they'll pick up those behaviors from their parents, their teachers, society, people in their lives, and don't realize it. A lot of these are middle school, don't they remind you of
Definitely.
middle school behaviors in the playground, of how we isolate people into groups, cliques, for example. How you know you have an unhealthy work environment is if there's a presence of cliques, because people form cliques to stay safe and to raise their sense of self-esteem. So
it's about safety then.
It is. And the key is that until we are safe, our patients won't be safe. The caregivers need to be safe to think clearly and to know that people have their back.
And so one of the best ways to do that is when you find yourself in this situation, is maybe go to a colleague and check it out. This happened to me. What do you think?
Right.
Give me some feedback. Am I being too sensitive in this situation, or do you think this is something I really need to deal with?
Right. Creating an atmosphere where people can come up to you and to give you feedback. That's what professionals do. And I can give you a specific example. What nurses normally do, because the style of communication is passive-aggressive, is if I walk into the report room and I hear somebody say right before I walk into the room, Kathleen's such a slacker, she always dumps on the next shift. I hate following her. The normal, typical response is to quickly, for me to go find my best friend and say, Diane, did you hear what she said about me? That's just not true. And so what you can do is to start by going to that person and saying, excuse me, I heard you say that I was a slacker and I dumped on the next shift. I was devastated when I heard you say that, because I'd never intentionally leave work for another nurse to do. Can you please tell me about the things that you're finding so that I can fix them and be a member of the team? I can't get there without your success. It's totally different energy,
right?
And it's about standing in your own power. And in the end, this is all about power.
And so this is really important to start having these kind of conversations, to feel empowered to speak up, and to begin to not second guess yourself, but to ask for feedback.
Right, and when you said second guess, that's what most people do. When I collected the stories and I asked people, why didn't you leave? Why would you put up with it? The number one answer was always, I thought it was me. I thought it was my fault. I thought it wasn't good enough. And so we internalize it right away. Don't think anything. Check it out. Don't create your story until you know why. somebody has behaved in that way. There's nothing wrong with asking.
So how do you start a conversation about this if you want to begin to talk about that?
I think that I'd ask, first of all, to ask somebody, always have a conversation in private. Can I talk to you for a minute in private? And then I would begin by saying, I noticed that. I noticed that you rolled your eyes.
You know, now that as you learn about this and you know about these behaviors, how do you bring that up and start talking about
to my colleagues?
To your colleagues?
Well, one thing you can do is download a flyer on what is nurse-to-nurse hostility and list these overt and covert behaviors that we call horizontal hostility. One very simple technique that I use is I give it to the secretary and give her a yellow highlighting pen and say, could you highlight any behaviors that you saw here during the last week? And then even if you have a perfect environment, I would still think that's a great exercise to do every week, to have people highlight the behaviors they see and put them up so that someday there's nothing to highlight, for example. So the number one thing you can do is call it what it is. It's not just a behavior pattern. It's not an attitude problem. It's a cultural phenomena that undermines not only ourselves but our patients.
Exactly, and I think one key thing you said too is it's kind of like you can't see the forest for the trees. You don't really realize it's there until you do start calling it by its name.
That's right, and it's important.